Greetings, it is I, Tantus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on the Pathfinder role-playing game system. We've been talking about the environments you can explore, and I talked all about the wilderness in the previous episodes. In this one, let's move into urban environments. Now, there are a lot of comparisons between urban environments and dungeons, but there are two main differences. I mean, you've got walls, doors, corridors, all that stuff. All that stuff is the same. The differences are, of course, resources you can get in a town and law. Now let's talk about each of these. Resources. If I'm in a town, I can buy and sell goods. I can go to places where I can get materials I might need. In a larger city, there might be very powerful NPCs or specialists that are producing items that I want to get in any like smaller towns that I might need for various jobs that I will require. I can also go to an inn pretty much any time to rest and recuperate. As long as there's money there, I can stay and recover. This is really the main point that differs adventures based upon dungeons and urban environments. Pacing. Your players basically control the pacing a lot more than you because they can control when they're getting new supplies, when they're going into an inn to rest up. This means they have that control over the pacing of the entire adventure. Now, the other big factor, of course, is law. Most dungeons are going to be lawless. There's not going to be really control over. A city is going to have a control of law. They're usually going to frown upon, murdering and looting people and have other rules in place. This doesn't mean you can't murder and loot things. Usually things like monsters, most of the time, are basically not protected by the law. Most cities look at monsters and be like, yeah, we don't want them there. They're dangerous. They're going to hurt the city. Do what you want to them. But just because you're evil doesn't mean the law is going to punish you. You could run into evil villains within a city, and you really can't do anything about them. They're protected by the law. As long as they're not doing anything wrong, you got nothing. Now, if you watch them doing something wrong, well, even then, that's vigilante justice, going after them. And cities frown on vigilante justice very often. Most of the time, if you bring them to justice, you'll need to go to some kind of court and testify, provide evidence that this person was doing something horrible, and that you were justified in whether you killed them or basically brought them before the guards. So there is this level of requirement that's much different than just being out in a dungeon. Now, there are other laws that can be in place. There could be regulations on weapons, certain types of items, or even spells. But the weapons and items, they could be confiscated before you come into town, or at the gates. They could take your weapons. They could take holy symbols. It's hard to say whatever a town will have the regulation for, but plenty of them exist. As for spells, spells could be outlawed, or certain types of spells. And if you're identified casting a spell, or a certain type of spell if it's outlawed, you're in trouble with the law then. You're breaking the rules of the town. So these regulations can be in place, and this code of laws can add this entire level to the gameplay. Now let's talk about the features of a town, because there are some important ones we want to talk about. The walls. Most small cities or larger have walls around them. These are probably going to be stone walls. That's the majority of them. And if we're talking about a small city, it's probably going to be about 5 feet thick, 20 feet tall. It'll have some crenulation at the top so that the guards can stand on top of this wall and have something protecting them in front of them, like a low wall in front of them. Effectively, they're going to have a defense against those on the other side of the wall. And granted, you're not always going to get guards there. It's just a space for them. Climbing a city wall is DC 30. They tend to be very smooth and hard to climb on the outside. Now, per 10-foot section of this wall, if you end up wanting to attack it, has an AC of 3, hardness of 8, and 450 hit points. So if you can do that much damage to that 10-foot basically square in the wall, you can break your way through it. Now, when we get to larger walls, it becomes harder. When we get to the next size up in the city, traditionally they're going to be 30 feet tall, 10 feet wide, and that's going to be about 720 feet to carve a 10-foot basically movement through the wall. So it becomes much more difficult. 720 per square I'm basically carving out of it. And when we get to the metropolis walls, they're going to be about 40 feet tall, 15 feet wide, and 1,170 approximately hit points that you're going to have to bash through to clear your 10 by 10 by 5 area in the wall. So it's taking quite a while to dig through this wall. Now the thing about metropolises is this might not be the only wall you would need to dig through to invade a city. Metropolises tend to have either other walls in the city that represent older city walls from when it was a much smaller city, or they could have their various districts cordoned off by walls, kind of separated out. Those are both options which do exist, which kind of cement the area that this metropolis takes up. Now, another feature is, of course, watchtowers. Watchtowers exist usually irregularly spaced, and the fact is that most cities don't tend to always man them. You will find some people put in charge of looking after them, but the fact is it's hard to tell if it's going to be manned or not just because of the nature of they don't have the personnel, and unless the city is being threatened by being under attack, no one's really keeping a lookout too much. You'll probably have a few of them, but not all. Now they tend to be about 10 feet higher than the wall, and they will have towards the top arrow slits basically on the floor from the top, so that you can look out into the area below the tower, shoot arrows out, and at the very top it's going to have that crenulation all around it so that a couple guards could be on the top looking out and still have some protection. Now, depending on the size of the tower, it depends on how thick it is. It tends to have a diameter of about 5 times however thick the city walls are. So for the smallest walls, it would be 25-foot diameter. The biggest ones, well, 65-foot diameter. You can see the difference here. For a small tower, you're probably only going to have a ladder going up to the top. The larger one, there's probably going to be staircase going up to the top. Now the doors on this tower are probably going to be heavy wooden doors with iron reinforcements and good locks on them. The keys are probably going to be kept with the captain of the guards, that traditional person that's going to carry the keys for all of these towers. Though usually within the barracks or within a castle or whatever administration, there might be copies of these keys, just in case they need to have someone else use and get into these places. Now let's talk about gates into the city, because we've talked about the walls, so let's talk about entering into it. One of the more traditional gates is going to have some kind of gatehouse, and then a set of portcullises. In between those two portcullises, there might be arrow slits or murder holes above there, basically creating this zone that if someone should break into the first portcullis, they might have to deal with a lot of things like killing them before they can get open the second one, making it difficult to just sort of plow through there. Larger cities are going to tend to have this sort of format to make it more difficult to break in through these main gates. Smaller cities and some other cities tend to have the more common double doors that are big iron gates. These big iron doors are going to be the main way most people are going to enter into a city, especially the small ones, as I said. They're going to be open during the day and closed and either locked or barred during the night. Usually, though, a city will leave one door open at night after sunset, well guarded, ready to close it if necessary, keeping an eye out. And if someone would approach the guards, if they seem honest or they have the correct paperwork, or sometimes if they bribe the guards, they can be let in through these gates. Now let's talk about the guards, because that's actually an important feature of a city. The main military force of a city is approximately 1% of the total adult population of that city. Now it can have a militia or conscripted soldiers equal to 5% of the total population. So you can see there's a difference here. One is based on the adults, the other is based on the total population. Now, when we talk about the military, the soldiers, they effectively are the law enforcement. They function like what police officers would be to us in modern day, kind of patrolling and keeping the law within the city. Now, this doesn't mean that they won't help defend a city. That is a secondary job of them. If an invasion or attack happens, they will do their best to join in that. But that is where our militia / conscripted soldiers really come in. When an attack happens, they will be the ones that rise up to defend against it and protect the city from warring factions. Now, our military, our soldiers, usually are divided up into 3 8-hour shifts. There's a day shift, which approximately 30% of the military force is on duty then, and then an evening and a night shifts, which each of those shifts will have the other 35%, the other 70% split in half. Now, of these shifts, 80% of the shifts, so 8 and 10, are going to be on patrol in the city. They're going to be assigned an area or told an area to patrol and move out there. The other 20 are going to be on guard in various locations stationed throughout the city. Some of them could be more critical areas, which some guards were going to be kept in. Others could just be simple guardhouses spread throughout the city. The point is that they're going to be in places that if an alarm is raised, they're ready to join in and move into that area. They are the backup of the patrol. Now, usually, if there's more than one district or section of the city, each of them is going to have their own guardhouse, at least, where guards are going to be stationed. Now, your typical guard is going to be a first-level warrior. They're usually going to have some kind of officer, which can be a higher-level warrior, could be a fighter, or it could be some kind of spellcaster, either cleric, wizard, or sorcerer, all appropriate. There are some exceptions that you get some ones which are both multi-class characters, fighter, and usually one of the spellcasters. So that's it for today. I began talking about the urban environment. I introduced you to the basics of the urban environment and why it's so vastly different from exploring dungeons if you're having an adventure set in one. I began to talk about the features of the urban environment, talked about the walls of the city, the towers that you might encounter, the gates you might enter. I began talking about any living feature of a city, the guards you might encounter. In the next episode, I'm going to move into talking about siege engines, which you'd use in either war or to attack a city, maybe to defend a city too, and start moving to talking about weather, which when you're in the wilderness, when you're in cities, sometimes even when you're in dungeons, weathers can affect that. If the dungeon's a ruin that's above ground, well, yeah, weather's going to affect that. Underground, not so much. So if any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. For channel, the Empire, and the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon. Link in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.